Today marks the anniversary of one of my favorite video games of all time, Metal Gear Solid 2. The game has now been out for 20 years, yet the community, myself included, is still finding new things to analyze and discuss. Instead of offering a comprehensive overview of the game, I've had a more specific aspect stuck on my mind. Traditionally, narrative conflict and storytelling will fall into one or more of the following categories: character versus character, character versus nature, character versus technology, character versus society, and character versus themselves. I believe that Metal Gear Solid 2 pioneered a new type of narrative conflict that could only exist in video games: character versus the player. Before we dive into MGS2, I should note that I consider character versus player to be a separate type of conflict from character versus author. An author is defined by having both infinite story knowledge and infinite influence over the narrative. Contrasting that, the player will generally be limited in both aspects. In my view, the developers of a game fulfill the role of author, while the player is more analogous to a reader or viewer. The difference with video games is that the person in the audience role has a level of interactivity that is not present in older forms of storytelling. In the case of MGS2, the player is able to physically control the actions of a character while simultaneously being a different person from said character. What incited this line of thought was a popular YouTube review of Metal Gear Solid 2. While I generally like the review, there's a particular section where I think he misses the point.
Raiden represents the player, which is why he barely talks about himself for most of the game. He's not strongly characterized to allow the player to relate. I think this is the commonly accepted view of Raiden in MGS2 nowadays, but one thing which puzzled me for a while was the child soldier backstory introduced later in the game. If Raiden is supposed to represent the player, then this seems like a big thing to drop in near the end. It's open to interpretation, of course, but my theory as to why this was included is because most people who would play MGS2 have probably been playing computer games since they were a child. To the world of MGS2, the player is essentially the child soldier that Raiden was, playing games since they could hold a controller.
Matt says he's confused about the inclusion of Raiden's backstory so late into the game, especially when we consider how much it seems to clash with the character's initial portrayal. I think this interpretation is the opposite of what was intended by Kojima. Rather than making the player relate to Raiden, I think the late inclusion of this backstory is intended as the catalyst of Raiden's meta-character arc. That arc is him becoming a distinct entity from the player. Up until this point of the game, Raiden has acted as an analog for the player.
I've completed 300 missions in VR. I feel like some kind of legendary mercenary.
The dog tags, which first become visible during this torture scene, act as a motif regarding Raiden's identity. Later in the game, the player learns that their own name is written on the tags. While Raiden does not acknowledge the tags at this point, they symbolically indicate an important shift in direction for Raiden's character. The reveal of his personal history starts a chain of events that gradually shapes him into his own person. From this, the player begins to become cognizant that Raiden is a distinct person from them with a distinct history. Similarly, Raiden begins to remember that he is his own individual as a result of him no longer repressing his past. Throughout the remainder of the game, Raiden rejects the player's will 3 times on his path to individuality. The first instance of this occurs shortly after his past is brought to light when he's released into arsenal gear without any weapons or clothing. Since Raiden is naked during this section of the game, he will constantly cover himself with his hands. This further limits the amount of potential actions that the player can resort to.
I can't do much naked, especially in this temperature.
That's true. You won't be able to attack or enter the hanging mode either.
This causes a conflict between the player's goal of wanting to complete the level and Raiden's personal goal of wanting to remain decent. Since Raiden assumes complete control over his hands, the player becomes forced to complete the level on Raiden's terms. After encountering Snake and retrieving their equipment, the player must now fight the mass-produced Metal Gear Rays. Earlier in the game, the player and Raiden learn of the 25 Rays housed inside of arsenal gear.
Mass-produced?
In reality, the player only needs to defeat 3 to 20 of them depending on the game's difficulty. The thing is, Raiden does not know this. The player, on the other hand, has probably inferred that the fight was not designed to be impossible. Thus, they persist. Raiden does not have a reason to be this optimistic, so once the player reaches the number of required kills on the Rays, Raiden will surrender to the boss fight. Considering that the hardest difficulty requires you to defeat 20 out of 25 Rays, I do not see this artificial limit on the fight to be entirely for balance reasons. I believe that this was intentionally done to illustrate something about Raiden. In this cutscene, Raiden rejects the player's will to fight the boss due to a lack of his own will. This marks Raiden's second refusal of the player's control. This example of Raiden's refusal to cooperate with the player may seem like a stretch, but here's my justification. Since the big shell is revealed to be
an orchestrated recreation of Shadow Moses,
MGS2's story structure heavily mimics that of MGS1. The Metal Gear Solid 1 equivalent of the Ray fight would obviously be the fight with Metal Gear Rex. During the Rex boss battle, this happens.
No! Fire the stinger!
Fox, can you really shoot? You'll kill him too!
Now, in front of you, I can finally die.
Interestingly, Snake disregards the player's inputs during this boss fight. He actively refuses to shoot at Rex, not wanting to harm Gray Fox. This is clear evidence that Kojima was already toying with the idea of character versus player back in 1998. While this concept wasn't fully realized within the first Metal Gear Solid, it ended up being implemented more meaningfully, albeit subtly, in the sequel's Metal Gear fight. Raiden's final rejection of the player comes shortly after his victory over Solidus. Raiden now can be seen wearing dog tags around his neck for the second time in the game. In real life, a pet's collar and tag indicate a person's ownership over said pet. In the realm of humans, military dog tags symbolically indicate the military's ownership over a given soldier. Metal Gear Solid 2's dog tags represent the player's ownership over Raiden's identity. Raiden's realization that he's been wearing dog tags this entire time represents him finally seeing that he was being controlled.
Does something like a self exist inside of you?
Raiden now begins to question who he really is, and Snake advises him to decide that for himself. Raiden then removes the dog tags and tosses them aside, vowing to choose his own path in life. With this final decision, Raiden has completely rejected the player's control. Going forward, there are no remaining gameplay sections where the player can control Raiden. Instead, they are relegated to a passive role, watching Raiden continue his new life for a short time within the remaining cutscene.
Raiden, are you receiving? We're still here.
I'd like to thank everyone that gave me feedback while making this video. Even though it was less than 10 minutes long, it actually took a lot of time to make. If you liked the video, feel free to give a thumbs up and subscribe for future content. I encourage discussion in the comments, and I'll try to read and respond to as many as I can. If you're looking for sources or my Patreon link, those will both be available down in the description. Thanks for watching.